Well, hi everyone, and welcome back to another edition of Adam's Music Box, where today we're celebrating the anniversary of Aisha's first album going #1 in the US. Now, why is that significant? Well, Aisha was one of the first bands within the broader rock and roll genre, in the sense that the music of the people in the band was consumed by rock and roll audiences. It was the first in that genre to cross over. Now, we hear a lot about crossover artists. Now, what does that mean? It generally means that they go from having success in one genre to having even bigger success in a different genre. Now, who might be the most famous crossover artist of all time? Well, that would be Taylor Swift, because she began as a Nashville based country artist, and she became the most successful female pop artist, many would say, and the sales, I think, will soon bear that out in terms of the streaming, of course, in of all time. There were many others before her. You could say that Glenn Campbell was an example of someone who initially found success on the country charts, but very rapidly became a go-to pop star for America and for global audiences. Shania Twain is an example of that. In the jazz world, David Sanborn, who we lost recently, went from someone whose music tended to be listened to and consumed by jazz audiences to someone who had instrumental pop hits in the late 80s. And he went and did the Letterman circuit and all the rest of it as someone in the pop world, but less apparently in the jazz world, would do. Within rock, there are many subgenres, and because rock tends to be, along with hip hop, tribal music, these genres don't always get along. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, if you like heavy metal, anything that isn't heavy enough is terrible, and I will never listen to that. In the rap world, you of course had the East Coast versus West Coast sound in the 90s and all of the various cultural phenomenon that at a time made people choose camps. You can't like Biggie if you like Tupac or vice versa. Now, most people think that's quite asinine. And musically, it's always been silly because music should be appreciated on its merits, not on its genres or sort of tribal cultural affiliations. But things being what they were, progressive rock was something that was quite prominent in the early and mid 70s. Some of the bands hung on and had a lot of success in the late 70s, particularly in the US and parts of Europe, Holland, for instance. But by the early 80s, prog rock had kind of vanished from the charts. You in a few years see Marillion come back and sort of resurrect that proggy sound, at least for UK audiences. They never had huge success in America. They had some. But that classic 70s prog sound was kind of dead. So, what did artists have to do? They had to adapt. And another word for adaptation is crossing over. And while we had success from, yes, crossing over into sort of progressive popular rock, Rush brought in synthesizers and updated the sound for the 80s. There are other examples too. Genesis, with Phil Collins taking the lead after 1976, they decided to push themselves in a more sort of pulsating rhythm and pop direction, although a lot of this stuff was still very complex and progressive well into the 80s. But one album that really stands out as the king of prog bands crossing over into pop rock, into AOR, which was sort of the official label of popular rock music, things like Journey, things like Boston, things like Foreigner. And this was, of course, Asia. Now, Asia had very unprog-like beginnings, I should say, because where most prog bands are sort of formed in a smoke-filled room, with Asia they were actually formed by a record label, Geffen, no less. But all of the musicians were bona fide stars in their own right. There was John Wetton, who was the bassist, vocalist, and lead songwriter for the group, and he had been in King Crimson. He had been in the short lived but very, very loved among prog and fusion fans band UK. This was, of course, their first lineup was Bill Bruford, Eddie Jobson, Alan Holdsworth, and John Wetton. And there was a second lineup with Jobson, Wetton, and the great Zappa drummer Terry Bozzio, who went on to drum with just about everyone, including Missing Persons. But even in the UK days, Bill Bruford noted that Wetton was a bit frustrated with the overall proggy and jazzy direction of the band. After spending years in the most improvisational lineup of all the very improvisational lineups of King Crimson, Wetton wanted to really break out as a songwriter rather than someone who was orchestrating complex fusion suites or someone engaged in full-scale improv as King Crimson did live and a bit in the studio during the time he was in the band. His frustrations led him to do some solo work at the end of the 70s and early 80s. It was good stuff, but it went absolutely nowhere. So Asia, in this sense, represented a musical second chance for Wetton. He teamed up with Jeff Downes, who had a pop hit with the Buggles, Video Killed the Radio Star, and who was briefly in Yes for that odd but fantastic album Drama. Not a top-selling Yes album because, it didn't have John Anderson. Things now are a bit different, but oh well. So they were the core of Asia. They were the ones who wrote most of the music, and then to round out the sound, they brought in Steve Howe on guitar, one of the finest progressive guitarists of all time, most famous for being the longest-serving guitarist in Yes. And on drums, they brought in an out-of-work Carl Palmer because ELO was one of those prog bands that didn't survive the transition between the 70s bombast into the tighter, more technologically driven sounds of the 80s. Geffen did have high hopes for the Asia album. Audiences didn't really know what to expect. What they got was an extremely polished, well-written, really well-performed, and well-produced album of AOR with very much of a prog tinge to it. What did this mean? Well, for Wetton, it meant that he achieved his goal of really becoming a songwriter. And as a songwriter, his influence was none other than Brian Wilson. He sang about this fact a few Asia albums later on the song Voice of America, which was all about Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys. And when you listen to Asia, you can see that within that sound of 80s AOR, you really felt strong influences from Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys, who were, of course, superlative in terms of songwriting and in terms of harmonization. Absolutely stellar. And so crossovers can happen in all sorts of different ways. Asia, in an era where people were listening to Duran Duran, A Flock of Seagulls, Rod Stewart, who had by then fully adopted that 80s sound with modern synthesizers, drum machines, sequencers. And Asia kind of bucked the trend. They were both of their time, but also bucking the trend. They were of their time because AOR was, of course, still popular, especially among people in their later 20s and 30s. But it was also unique because you had a drummer in Carl Palmer who was anything but a drum machine. Carl Palmer was very loose with his rhythm and all about Buddy Rich style frills, no metronome he. Steve Howe, as a guitarist, very free-flowing, playing on hollow bodies at a time when very few people in AOR or any sort of popular music did at the time. So you had this prog guitarist and prog drummer playing with a prog keyboardist in Jeff Downes and a prog bassist and vocalist in John Wetton, who were pushing things in a pop direction. But unlike with UK, because Wetton's songs, his short, sharp, very memorable songs, became front and center, and they were all over MTV, all over the radio, and they crossed over. They crossed over from an obscure and increasingly underground prog genre that was past its prime into the pop charts, which just goes to show you that in the world of music, anything is possible. And for John Wetton, of course, it was an extraordinary life, but sadly, we lost him, I think, far too young. Very, very philosophical man, great sense of humor, very up on current affairs, and a friend to those he played around. So, if anything, Aisha is a tribute not only to his great songwriting, but his great passion for so many genres of music that he played so well. Like, subscribe. We will see you next time. Take care.